I've always been a bit of a tech enthusiast. When I moved into my studio apartment in a converted industrial warehouse downtown, the first thing I did was smart enable everything. I had voice-controlled lights, a smart thermostat, and a high-end security camera positioned right above my front door that sent alerts directly to my phone. Living in the city as a single woman in her late 20s, these gadgets weren't just toys, they were my peace of mind. It was a Tuesday in late October, and a classic autumn storm was punishing the city. The rain was rhythmic and heavy, blurring the glowing neon signs of the delis and bars across the street. I was curled up on my sofa, the warm sunset light preset turned on, working through a freelance coding project. The wind was whistling through the old iron window frames, creating a low, ghostly hum that I usually found comforting. At 11:42 p.m. my phone chimed. It was the distinct, sharp ping of my security app. Movement detected at front door, * the notification read. I didn't panic. In a busy hallway, it was usually just a neighbor or a delivery person heading to another unit. I swiped the notification to open the live feed. The hallway was empty. The black and white infrared footage showed the long, carpeted corridor, silent and still. I shrugged it off as a glitch caused by the shadows of the storm flickering through the hallway window. 10 minutes later it happened again, ping. I checked the feed. Again nothing, but this time I noticed something odd. The status light on the camera, the tiny blue LED that indicated it was recording, wasn't blue, it was red. Red meant someone was live viewing the feed from another device. A cold shiver raced down my spine. My account was private. No one else had the password. I quickly logged into the app settings to check active sessions. My heart stopped when I saw 3 devices logged in, my phone, my laptop, and a third device labeled simply as * user 01. I immediately terminated the session and changed my password, my fingers trembling over the glass screen. I told myself it was a technical error, maybe a previous tenant's device was somehow still linked. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It felt like eyes were pressing against the back of my neck. I decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would reset my nerves. I used the voice command, "Alexa, turn off all lights." The apartment plunged into darkness. I began walking toward my bedroom, guided by the faint glow of the city lights outside. Suddenly, the lights in the kitchen flashed on, not the warm sunset color I used, but a harsh, blinding 100% white. "Alexa, lights off," I said, my voice cracking. The lights stayed on. In fact, they started to strobe on, off. Then the smart speakers in every room began to emit a low, distorted static. Through the static, a voice began to emerge. It wasn't the smooth, robotic tone of the AI. It was a human voice, heavy, wet, and whispering my name. Clara, look at the cameras." I froze in the middle of the living room. I slowly turned my head toward the security camera above the door. The red light was back on. It was tracking me. As I moved an inch to the left, the camera lens whirred, tilting to stay focused on my face. I lunged for my router, ripping the power cord from the wall. The apartment went silent. The lights stayed on, but the strobing stopped. I stood in the sudden quiet, gasping for air, the smell of ozone and rain filling the room. I thought I had cut the connection, but then my phone, which was sitting on the coffee table, began to play a video. It was a recording from 5 minutes ago. It showed me sitting on the sofa working on my laptop, but the camera angle wasn't from the front door. The angle was from the air vent directly above my head. Someone hadn't just hacked my smart devices, they had installed their own hidden hardware inside my home. I looked up at the vent. A tiny pinhole lens was glinting in the harsh kitchen light. Then came the sound that broke me, a soft, rhythmic tapping, not from the door, not from the window, it was coming from inside the wall behind my bed. Tab, tab, tab. I didn't grab my shoes, I didn't grab my laptop. I grabbed my keys and my phone and bolted for the door. I didn't wait for the elevator, I took the stairs 3 at a time, my heart slamming against my ribs. I burst out into the rainy street, the cold water feeling like a blessing against my overheated skin. I ran 2 blocks to a 24-hour diner and called the police. When the officers searched my apartment, they found a nightmare. Behind the drywall in my bedroom, there was a narrow maintenance crawl space that the building managers had forgotten about. Inside, they found a sleeping bag, a tablet connected to my home's Wi-Fi, and hundreds of hours of saved footage of me. The user 01 was the building's night security guard. He had used his master key to enter my apartment while I was at work, installing the pinhole cameras and syncing them to my own smart home hub. He had been living in the wall behind my headboard for over a month, watching me sleep, listening to my private conversations, and slowly learning how to manipulate my lights and speakers to terrify me. He was arrested that night, but the psychological scars remained. I moved out the next day, giving away every smart device I owned. I live in a different city now, in an old house with manual locks, analog clocks, and not a single camera in sight. Sometimes, when a light bulb flickers or a phone notification pings in the middle of a rainy night, I still feel that cold, red light of a camera lens burning into my skin. I've learned that technology doesn't just make life easier, it makes it easier for the monsters to find their way inside. Last year I decided to take a solo writing retreat. I rented a cabin in the North Carolina mountains, a small, rustic A-frame tucked deep into a valley where cell service was a myth and the nearest paved road was a 20-minute drive away. The owner told me the cabin was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear for a while. At the time, it sounded poetic. By the third night, it felt like a warning. A massive thunderstorm had stalled over the valley. The rain wasn't just falling, it was a physical weight drumming against the metal roof with a deafening roar. Because of the cabin's design, the front wall was almost entirely glass, offering a panoramic view of the dark woods. As night fell, that view turned into a giant black mirror. I couldn't see out, but anyone in the woods could see everything inside. I was sitting by the wood-burning stove trying to focus on my manuscript when I heard a sound that didn't match the rhythm of the storm. It was a metallic asterisk clack clack clack. I looked toward the glass wall. At first I saw nothing but my own reflection, a pale, nervous-looking guy holding a coffee mug. Then the lightning flashed, illuminating the deck. A set of heavy iron wind chimes that had been hanging from the porch rafters were now lying on the wooden deck boards. They hadn't fallen, the hook was still intact. It looked as though someone had reached up, unhooked them, and set them down. My pulse quickened. I walked to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to cut the interior reflection. I scanned the tree line. The wind was whipping the branches into a frenzy, but nothing seemed out of place. I checked the lock on the heavy wooden door and decided it was time to head upstairs to the loft bed. I was halfway up the wooden ladder when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic whistling. It was coming from the porch. It was a cheerful, upbeat tune, the kind of thing you'd whistle while walking to work. In the middle of a mountain storm, miles from civilization, it was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. I froze on the ladder, my knuckles white as I gripped the rungs. The whistling stopped. Then a voice called out, distorted by the wind but unmistakably human. I know the wood is wet, but I could really use a fire. I didn't answer. I reached the loft, crawled into the shadows, and grabbed the heavy fire poker I had brought up with me earlier. I didn't have a phone signal, but I had a satellite emergency transponder in my bag. I fumbled for it, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would break. Click. The sound of the front door handle turning echoed through the open cabin. The lock held, but then came the scratching. It wasn't at the door, it was at the glass. I peered over the edge of the loft. A man was standing on the deck, his face pressed against the glass. He was holding a flashlight, but he wasn't pointing it inside. He was pointing it at his own face. He was pale, with deep-set eyes and a jagged scar running across his chin. He was smiling, a wide, toothy grin that looked painful. He began to tap on the glass with a large, rusted hunting knife. Tap, tap, tap. "It's cold out here, neighbor," he shouted over the thunder. "I saw you through the trees, you look so warm in there." He started to walk along the length of the glass wall, dragging the tip of the knife across the pane. The screeching sound was like nails on a chalkboard, amplified by the acoustics of the A-frame. He reached the corner of the house and disappeared from my line of sight. A moment later, I heard the sound of wood splintering. He was at the small kitchen window in the back, the one window I had forgotten to check. I pressed the emergency button on my transponder, praying the signal would reach the satellite through the thick storm clouds. Downstairs, I heard the kitchen window shatter. The sound was followed by the heavy asterisk thud of boots hitting the linoleum floor. "Ready or not," the man whispered. I could hear him moving through the kitchen, opening the fridge, the clink of glass bottles. He was making himself at home. I stayed perfectly still in the loft, tucked behind a stack of extra blankets. I heard him walk to the center of the room. He poked at the embers in the stove, adding a fresh log. The cabin began to brighten as the fire caught. "You're a quiet one," he said, his voice coming from the base of the ladder. but I can hear your heart, it's fast, like a bird's. He placed a hand on the first rung of the ladder. I could see his fingers thick, calloused, and wet with rain. I gripped the fire poker, ready to swing the moment his head cleared the floorboards. But then a miracle happened. The sound of a heavy engine roared up the muddy driveway. Bright high beams cut through the glass wall, flooding the cabin with white light. It was a local park ranger. My emergency signal had gone through, and since he was already patrolling for downed trees, he was only a few miles away. The man at the ladder didn't scream or run. He simply let go of the rung, walked to the broken kitchen window, and slid back out into the night like a shadow returning to the dark. By the time the ranger reached the door, the cabin was empty except for me, shaking in the loft with a fire poker in my hand. The ranger searched the woods with a thermal scope, but the heavy rain and the dense brush made it impossible to track anyone. The next morning, as I was packing my car to leave, I found something on the porch. The iron wind chimes had been moved again. They were now arranged on the deck to spell out a single word. Later. I never went back to the mountains. I don't go on writing retreats anymore, and I certainly don't stay anywhere where the walls are made of glass. Because I know that out there in the dark valleys where the rain never seems to stop, someone is still whistling, waiting for a warm fire and a quiet neighbor. I had finally managed to save enough money to move out of the city and into a quiet suburban fixer-upper in a historic district of Massachusetts. The house was a charming craftsman from the 1920s, complete with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a basement that felt like a time capsule. It was perfect, or at least, that's what I told myself as I signed the closing papers. It was my first weekend in the house, and the New England weather was putting the old structure to the test. A nor'easter had blown in, bringing with it a relentless freezing rain that rattled the window panes and made the old pipes groan. My moving boxes were still stacked high in the living room, creating a labyrinth of cardboard. I was exhausted from a day of unpacking, sitting on the floor with a pizza and a laptop, enjoying the sound of the rain. At around 11:00 p.m., I heard a sound that made me stop mid-bite. It was a rhythmic asterisk thump-thump-thump coming from directly beneath my feet. The basement was the only part of the house I hadn't spent much time in. It was dark, damp, and filled with the previous owner's junk, old trunks, broken furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. I assumed the noise was just the water heater or a loose pipe reacting to the storm. I went back to my pizza, but the thumping didn't stop. It grew louder, moving from one side of the living room floor to the other as if something or someone was packing back and forth in the dark below. I stood up, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and walked to the basement door in the kitchen. I hesitated, my hand on the cold brass knob. "It's just an old house," I whispered, trying to convince myself. I opened the door and was met with a gust of chilled, earthy air. I descended the wooden stairs, each one screaming under my weight. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, reflecting off the damp stone walls. I reached the bottom and panned the light around. The basement was empty, save for the shadows and the smell of wet concrete. I walked over to the furnace, checked the pipes, and found nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I turned to head back upstairs, I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old wardrobes, there was a small wooden door, barely 4 feet high, that I hadn't noticed during the initial walkthrough. It was partially obscured by a heavy wool rug. I moved the rug and pulled the small door open. It led to a crawl space that stretched beneath the back porch. I shone my light inside and my heart nearly stopped. There was a makeshift bed made of old blankets and stolen sofa cushions. Next to the bed was a small pile of food wrappers from the snacks I had bought just 2 days ago. But the most terrifying thing was the wall of the crawl space. It was covered in hundreds of Polaroid photos. I leaned in closer. Every single photo was of the interior of the house. There were pictures of the kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom. There were photos of me sleeping, eating, and even one of me standing at the front door with my keys on the day I moved in. I backed away, the flashlight slipping in my sweaty grip. As I turned to run for the stairs, I heard the basement door at the top of the steps click * shut. I froze. The light from the kitchen, which had been spilling down the stairs, was gone. I was in total darkness. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs, not coming down, but someone already on the steps, slowly descending toward me. "You've been moving my things," a voice croaked. It was a man's voice, thin and dry like dead leaves skittering on pavement. "I don't like it when people touch my things." I didn't wait to see his face. I lunged for the small crawlspace door, scrambled inside, and pulled it shut behind me. I crawled as far back into the dirt and cobwebs as I could, my breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. I turned off my flashlight, the darkness becoming absolute. I heard his boots hit the concrete floor. He walked over to the small door and tapped on it with something metallic, likely a key or a knife. Tap, tap, tap. "I've lived here for 40 years, he whispered, his face likely inches from the wood. "The bank said I had to leave, but the house knows I belong here, you're just a guest." He sat down on the other side of the door. I could hear him breathing, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to last for hours. He started to hum a lullaby, a haunting melody that was barely audible over the roar of the rain outside. I knew I couldn't stay there. I remembered that the crawlspace had a small vent leading to the backyard for ventilation. I began to dig through the loose dirt at the back of the space, my fingernails tearing as I clawed at the earth. I reached the metal grating of the vent and pushed with all my strength. It popped outward into the wet grass. I squeezed through the narrow opening, the cold rain hitting my face like a shock. I didn't look back at the house. I ran to my car, fumbled with the keys, and drove straight to the police station in my pajamas, covered in basement dirt and cobwebs. The police raided the house within 30 minutes. They found the man still sitting in the basement, clutching a rusted set of house keys. It turned out he was the son of the previous owner who had been foreclosed upon. He had never left. He had built a network of small passages behind the drywall and under the floors, allowing him to move through the house unseen. He was charged with stalking and breaking and entering, but the psychological damage was done. I never spent another night in that craftsman house. I sold it at a loss a month later. Now, I live in a modern apartment where every wall is solid concrete. But on rainy nights when the wind rattles the windows, I still find myself looking at the floorboards, wondering if someone is beneath me, packing back and forth, waiting for their guest to leave. I moved into a small, secluded cottage in the Pacific Northwest to focus on my master's thesis. The house was perfect, old, wooden, and surrounded by a thick fog that seemed to never lift. My only neighbor was an elderly man named Mr. Henderson who lived in a house so dilapidated it looked abandoned. He was quiet, mostly keeping to himself, but I often caught him standing at the edge of his porch, staring at my front door for hours at a time. It was a Friday night, and a brutal autumn storm had turned the surrounding woods into a chaotic mess of swaying branches and howling wind. The rain was constant, a rhythmic drumming that made the cottage feel like a small island in a dark sea. I was sitting at my desk, the glow of my lamp the only light in the room, when I heard a soft asterisk thump against my front door. I assumed it was a fallen branch, but then it happened again, thump, thump. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty, but sitting on the welcome mat was a small cardboard box wrapped in damp twine. I hesitated, then opened the door just wide enough to grab it. Inside was a single old-fashioned porcelain doll with cracked skin and staring glass eyes. There was no note. I set it on the counter, feeling a wave of unease. I figured it was just Mr. Henderson being eccentric, perhaps giving away old trinkets. But an hour later, the power flickered and died. The cottage plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. In the sudden silence, I heard the sound of my back door, the one leading to the mudroom, creak open. I didn't have a weapon, so I grabbed a heavy iron candle holder and retreated into the hallway. I didn't turn on my flashlight yet. I didn't want to give away my position. I stood perfectly still, listening. Through the roar of the rain, I heard a wet, dragging sound coming from the kitchen. Schlick drag, schlick drag. It sounded like someone was pulling something heavy across the floorboards. I clicked on my light and swept it toward the kitchen. The floor was covered in muddy, black streaks. The porcelain doll was no longer on the counter. It was sitting in the middle of the floor, its glass eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. "Mr. Henderson," I called out, my voice trembling, "is that you?" No answer, only the sound of the wind screaming through the eaves. I moved toward the kitchen to lock the back door, but as I reached the doorway, I saw him. Mr. Henderson wasn't standing. He was on all fours in the corner of the room, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. He wasn't wearing a coat or shoes despite the freezing rain outside. His skin was pale and translucent, and his eyes were wide, fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. "You didn't say thank you," he whispered. His voice was a wet rasp like air escaping a punctured lung. I backed away, but he moved with a sudden, predatory speed, scuttling across the floor like an insect. I sprinted for the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached my bedroom, slammed the door, and pushed my heavy dresser in front of it. I huddled in the corner of the room, dialing 911. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, but the signal was weak, breaking up between the claps of thunder. Outside the door, the scratching began. It wasn't at the handle. It was at the bottom of the door near the floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Then a small, pale hand reached through the gap beneath the door. The fingers were long and skeletal, fumbling blindly for the edge of the dresser. "I have more gifts," Henderson's voice drifted through the wood. "I have so many things to show you." I heard a heavy asterisk thud against the door, then another. He was throwing his entire body weight against it. The dresser groaned, sliding an inch across the floor. I looked around the room for an escape. My bedroom was on the second floor with a small window overlooking the roof of the porch. I smashed the window with the candle holder, the glass shattering into the night. I climbed out onto the slick shingles, the rain instantly soaking through my clothes. I slid down the roof and jumped, landing hard in the mud below. I didn't stop to check for injuries. I ran toward my car, but the tires were slashed deep, jagged cuts that made the vehicle useless. I turned and ran into the woods, the darkness swallowing me whole. I hid in a hollowed-out log for hours, clutching my phone until the battery died, watching the lights of my cottage flicker back on in the distance. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the cottage empty. The back door was wide open, and the kitchen was filled with hundreds of porcelain dolls, all arranged in a circle in the center of the room. They searched Mr. Henderson's house and found it completely empty of furniture. The floorboards had been ripped up and the walls were covered in hand-drawn maps of my cottage, every vent, every crawl space, and every lock. But Mr. Henderson was nowhere to be found. I moved out that day. I didn't even take my clothes. I left everything behind, including the master's thesis I had worked on for 2 years. I live in the city now on the 12th floor of a high-rise. But every time I hear an asterisk thump at my door or find a package I didn't order, I don't open it. I just leave it there, wondering if the gifts are finally starting again. I don't have children, but I recently bought a high-tech baby monitor with night vision and 360-degree rotation. Why? Because I had a persistent problem with porch pirates stealing packages from my front door, and the monitor was a cheap, effective way to keep an eye on my living room and the front entryway while I was tucked away in my home office at the back of the house. It was a Monday night, and a massive storm system was moving through the valley. The rain was coming down in thick gray sheets, and the wind was making the old weather stripping on my windows whistle like a tea kettle. I was sitting at my desk, my headphones on, deep into a data entry project. On my second monitor, I had the live feed from the baby monitor pulled up. The living room was bathed in the ghostly green glow of the camera's infrared night vision. At 12:15 a.m., the motion alert on the camera triggered. A small green box appeared on the screen, tracking movement near the front window. I pulled off my headphones, listening to the house. All I heard was the rain. I looked back at the screen. The living room appeared empty. I assumed it was just the shadows of the trees outside casting moving patterns through the glass. I was about to minimize the window when the camera's auto-track feature kicked in. The lens whirred, slowly panning to the left. It followed something that I couldn't see. The tracking box was moving across the empty floor, heading toward the sofa. My skin began to crawl. I used the app on my phone to manually override the camera. I panned it back toward the window. That's when I saw it. The window wasn't just wet from the rain, it was open. Just a few inches, but enough for a thin, pale arm to reach through and unlatch the lock. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I watched the screen as a figure dressed in a dark, oversized raincoat slid through the window with the grace of a shadow. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't look for a TV or a laptop. Instead, he walked straight to the center of the room and looked directly at the camera. In the infrared light, his eyes looked like 2 glowing white pits. He knew exactly where the monitor was. He walked over to it, his face filling the entire screen. He was whispering something, his lips moving in a rhythmic, chanting pattern. I reached for my phone to call the police, but as I did, the monitor's 2-way audio feature activated. A low, distorted voice came through the speakers on my desk. "I can see you, Sarah. You're in the back room. The door is unlocked." The realization that he knew my name and my exact location sent a wave of cold terror through my body. I lunged for my office door, slamming it shut and locking it just as I heard the heavy asterisk thud of footsteps in the hallway. I huddled under my desk, the only light coming from the glowing monitor screen. I watched the live feed as the man walked back into the living room. He picked up a kitchen knife I had left on the counter and began to systematically carve something into the wooden coffee table. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was amplified through the monitor's microphone, filling my office. I was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, my voice a jagged whisper. "He's in the house. He's in the living room. He has a knife." The man stopped carving. He turned back to the camera and smiled. It wasn't a human smile, it was too wide, showing too many teeth. He held up the knife to the lens, the metal reflecting the infrared light. 10 minutes, he whispered through the speaker. "The police are 10 minutes away, I only need 5. He turned and began to walk toward my office door. I heard his boots on the hardwood, slow, deliberate, and heavy. He stopped right outside. I could see the shadow of his feet under the door. He didn't try to turn the handle. He just stood there, humming a low, tuneless melody that vibrated through the wood. Suddenly, the power cut out. The monitor screen went black. The office was plunged into total darkness. In the silence, I heard the sound of wood splintering. He wasn't kicking the door, he was using the knife to slowly shave away the wood around the lock. Shave, shave, shave. I scrambled to the window of my office, which led to a small side yard. I threw it open, the freezing rain hitting me like a wall. I climbed out, falling into the mud, and ran toward my neighbor's house, screaming for help. The police arrived exactly 8 minutes later. They found my front window open and the living room empty. But when they checked my office door, the wood around the lock had been completely carved away. Another 30 seconds and he would have been inside. The most terrifying part, however, was what they found on the coffee table. The man hadn't just carved a random pattern. He had carved my social security number, my date of birth, and the names of my parents into the wood. He wasn't a random intruder. He was someone who had been watching me digitally and physically for a very long time. The man was never caught. The police found a small jammer device hidden in my bushes that had interfered with my Wi-Fi, explaining why the camera had glitched. I moved out the next day and I never ever used smart cameras anymore. Now, when I stay home alone on a rainy night, I don't look at a screen to see what's happening in the other room. I just sit in the dark, listening to the rain and praying that the only thing outside my door is the wind. It's been 3 years since I moved into this apartment, but I still can't sleep when it rains. Most people find the sound of water hitting the glass soothing, like a natural white noise machine. For me, it sounds like a countdown. It sounds like the drumbeat of someone coming to finish what they started. My original house was a small, isolated rental on the edge of a wheat field in Kansas. I was 21, working a remote data entry job and living the quiet life I had always dreamed of. My nearest neighbor was a mile away and the horizon was nothing but flat land and big sky. But when the storms rolled in, that big sky felt like it was collapsing on top of the house. It was a Tuesday night and a massive cell was moving across the plains. The wind was so strong it made the house groan like an old wooden ship. I was in the kitchen making a pot of coffee to stay awake through the thunder when the first knock happened. It wasn't at the front door. It was at the back door, the one that led directly into the kitchen from the dark, open field. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. No one walked through those fields at night. There were no roads out there, just miles of tall, swaying wheat. I looked through the small window in the door. The rain was so thick I could barely see the porch railing, but a figure was standing there. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was just standing in the downpour, his clothes soaked through, clinging to his skin. "Can I help you?" I shouted through the wood, my hand hovering over the deadbolt to make sure it was thrown. The man didn't speak. He slowly raised his hand and pressed his palm against the glass. He stayed like that for a full minute, just staring into the kitchen, his eyes hidden in the shadows of the storm. Then, he turned around and walked back into the field, disappearing into the wheat like he had never been there at all. I called the local sheriff, but with the storm washing out the dirt roads, they told me it would be at least an hour before a deputy could get to me. "Stay inside, lock everything, and keep your lights on," the dispatcher advised. I followed her instructions to the letter. I went through the house, checking every window and every latch. I ended up in the master bedroom, the only room with a heavy solid core door and a separate lock. I sat on the bed, my laptop open, trying to distract myself. Around 1:00 a.m., the house went silent. The wind had died down to a low whistle and the rain had slowed to a steady, rhythmic drip. Then I heard a sound from downstairs. Creak, creak, creak. It was the sound of someone walking up the wooden staircase. I hadn't heard a window break. I hadn't heard a door being kicked in. He had found a way in silently, like a ghost. I scrambled into the walk-in closet, pulling the door shut and locking it from the inside. I held my breath, my heart thumping so loudly I was sure he could hear it through the walls. I didn't dare call the police back. I was afraid the sound of my voice would give me away. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They didn't hesitate. They walked straight to my bedroom door. I heard the handle jiggle, then the sound of a key sliding into the lock. Click. The bedroom door opened. I watched through the narrow gap under the closet door as the lights in the bedroom were flipped on. I could see a pair of wet, muddy boots moving across the carpet. He walked to the bed, sat down, and I heard the springs groan under his weight. He stayed there for 20 minutes. He didn't search the room. He didn't look for valuables. He just sat on my bed, breathing. Every few minutes, he would let out a low, dry chuckle that made the hair on my arms stand up. I know you're in the closet, Emily, he whispered. I haven't told anyone my name was Emily in years. I've been waiting for the rain to bring me back to you. He stood up and walked to the closet door. He didn't try to force it. He just leaned his forehead against the wood. I'll leave you a gift on the porch. Don't make me wait another 3 years. I heard him walk out of the room, down the stairs, and out the back door. I stayed in that closet until the sun came up and the sheriff's deputy finally arrived. When we went downstairs, the back door was wide open. Sitting on the kitchen table was a small silver locket. I opened it and my blood turned to ice. Inside was a photo of me, not from recently, but a photo of me as a child, playing in a backyard I hadn't seen in 15 years. The man was never caught. The police found that he had used a spare key that had been missing from my parents' house a decade ago. He hadn't just found me, he had been following me since I was a little girl, waiting for the perfect, rainy night to let me know he was still there. I moved across the country after that. I changed my name, my hair color, and my life. But every time the clouds turn gray and the first drop of rain hits the roof, I check the locks, I check the closets, and I pray that when the next knock comes, it's just the wind.